Greetings, everyone. You've stumbled upon Esoteric Babble. Today's discussion is going to center around the Eightfold Path, or the Noble Eightfold Path, or even maybe the Eightfold Path of the Nobles. We will talk about the various ways you could translate that later on. So to begin, let's talk about what is this Eightfold Path? Where does it come from? Where do we find it in the Buddha's teaching? We find it in a sutta called the Dhammacakkappavattanasuttaṃ. That means like the setting in motion of the Dharma wheel. So this is like the Buddha's first teaching, and he has set in motion the teaching of like the Dharma or the truth. So a potentially uninteresting to some people, but I think it's worth mentioning that when you come across Buddhist terms, unlike in Hinduism, which really, the language, which was the vehicle for the ideas, was Sanskrit. In Buddhism, we started with Pali, which was more of like just more of a spoken language, not really a literary or learned language. And so instead of finding these terms like sutra and karma and dharma, for instance, which we're familiar with from either the Hindu side or the Mahayana side of Buddhism, which did have texts written in Sanskrit later on, like the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, Prajna Paramita Sutras. In Theravada Buddhism, we are dealing with terms coming from the Pali. And so just keep in mind, like you'll hear me say sutta, that's really just the word sutra. Dhamma is dharma. Chakra, is... I think that might be chakra. That's the same as like the wheel, like what you find, the chakras. So just keep in mind when you hear discussions of Buddhism, depending on like what school it is, you're going to hear different terms brought up. And as far as that goes, like if you're talking about Zen in a Japanese sense, you might hear something like Muga, or in Chinese. I mean, they have their own terms. I think in Japanese, they say ukiyo for like the floating transient world, which comes from Chinese characters. I won't even attempt to pronounce those. So anyway, I realize not everyone's interested in the language aspect, but it's just something that it might seem confusing when you come across Buddhist terminology, that it's drawing upon different languages because of the course of how the religion and the ideas spread, culturally. Another thing that might seem confusing is, and I'm going to come back to like where this Eightfold Path is found, is that there are lots of seeming lists in Buddhism. So you'll hear people talk about the Eightfold Path. You'll hear people talk about the Four Noble Truths, the 3 marks of existence, maybe the 5 aggregates, and there are lists about of course, virtues, which which precepts people follow, the dependent origination, and so on and so forth. So, with the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, though, we can really boil that down. And sort of spoiler here, the Eightfold Path is the Fourth Noble Truth. And we'll come to that in a minute. The Four Noble Truths is not really the subject of this discussion, but it'll come up. And so if we go back, before I started to meander and digress, we were saying that this teaching is found in the Dhammacakkappavattanasuttaṃ, or the sutra where the Buddha set in motion his teaching, if we say it maybe a little less poetically. And here's another term you're going to hear a lot. actually, before he describes it as the Eightfold Path, he calls it the Majjhima Patipada, or the middle way, or the middle path. And we've probably heard this a lot in Buddhism. And I think to lots of people that means different things. It's sort of, I think when I first heard that, I assumed it meant like we were talking about, the Buddha meant moderation. And to some extent, that's true. It has a specific, there's a specific reason he uses it here. And the Buddha, before he was enlightened, he engaged in many very ascetic practices, very extreme ascetic practices, which could almost lead to someone's death, probably by fasting and being in the freezing cold in the Himalayas and so on and so forth. And he says that way you should not follow. He starts this sutra by saying, "O monks," and I think there were just 5 people there, 5 people who were in need of the teaching or wanted to listen to what the Buddha had to say. And he says there are 2 ways, actually, that you should avoid. You should avoid this extreme asceticism, and you should extreme just indulging in every pleasure, every sensual pleasure. So those are the 2 ways that don't lead to any advantage or profit. They won't do you any good in the end, he says. Instead, you should follow this middle path. And here, and I know it's taken me a long time to get to this, there's something very interesting about the middle path, this Eightfold Path, that I think sometimes is overlooked. And that is that the Buddha, before he actually lays out what these 8 things are, he mentions that this middle path was first of all completely understood by him. Like this is something that he has experienced for himself. And then he says, he uses these phrases where he says the middle path produces insight and knowledge. I think in this sense, and you can hear these, it's like Chaku Karani and Jnana Karani. He's talking about almost when we say insight, something like wisdom, or intuitive insight and intuitive knowledge, that sort of thing. And then he says something extremely interesting that I think we should take seriously. He says that this middle path will lead to calm, special kind of knowledge, like a gnosis, maybe, to enlightenment and to nirvana. And here's another term that you'll find that's different in the Pali Canon. They actually say nibbana, not nirvana, nibbana. So he says this middle path, if you follow it, it's going to produce this sort of intuitive insight and knowledge. It's going to lead to calm, which we know from sort of, that's something that we know meditation should do. It'll lead to this special kind of gnosis, maybe we could say, or maybe even possibly psychic powers, or a real, it'll lead to a development of your mind beyond what you might think is sort of normal. Or that would be one way to read that. Then it will lead to enlightenment, sammāvācā, and to nirvana. And I think that this is something that's extremely interesting, that if you follow these, this Eightfold Path, all of this, all of the aforementioned should be obtainable. And to me, that's just amazing that that would be the case. I think it's something that we should keep in mind. I mean, you don't always want to sort of obtain things. That's one of these paradoxical issues that arises in lots of spiritual pursuits, no matter what kind of angle you're coming at something from. We think that desire is kind of bad, but we want to have a desire for enlightenment. We want to, we have a desire for, even doing good things. And I believe Bhikkhu Bodhi mentioned that, there's in the Pali Canon a differentiation between wholesome and unwholesome desires. So sometimes desire is sort of, they use the word thirst, tanha. So you could have kusala tanha or tanha akusala, which would be the unwholesome variety. The akusala would be unwholesome. So it's interesting to think that, we normally don't want to generate a lot of desires, but actually the Buddha in other places in the canon specifically says a monk or, someone on the path should generate a desire for, sort of cultivating a, the right sort of mindset, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think it is fascinating to think that these various things, including enlightenment and nirvana, are something that should follow naturally as a consequence of practicing the Eightfold Path. So let's now get into the Eightfold Path. And this is actually, so after all this stuff is mentioned, the Buddha says, this Majjhima Patipada, this middle path, is also known by the Aryo Ataniko, or the Noble Eightfold Path. Again, we could get into that. Aryo is actually the word that is sort of the source of what people are translating as noble. It actually is connected with the word Aryan, and I think if you look it up in like the Pali Text Society's dictionary, they note that it sort of almost means something like a Buddhist. They didn't have the word Buddhist back then, of course. They wouldn't have used that word, but and it's similar to the way early Christians didn't, before there was Christianity, there were people practicing that faith. They didn't have a name for it yet. So in a way, this Eightfold Path is sort of the Eightfold Path, perhaps, of people who are Buddhists or people who are sort of practicing this teaching, So we don't have to get too hung up in this phrase, I don't think. I think it's more important to go on to what those 8 things are. And now this is the way I look at this, and I invite you to sort of see if this has any resonance for you. It kind of depends on one's background, but these 8 different items are basically, I think, even just to say them out loud, a kind of magic spell. And it's a magic spell in that it's almost like, this is just something that's come to me. It's not maybe the best analogy, but maybe if you're tired or you splash some water on your face, or maybe even if you're really hot and you splash some cool water on your face, you have this, it sort of brings you back into the moment, maybe. And I think that's what this kind of magic spell does. Like, you can just name the items and you're in a good position, or it's going to like help sort of focus. It'll help us focus on like, well, what's really necessary, and can let other things fall away. So I will just kind of go through this list here. I'll mention the Pali first. You don't have to. You can look it up if you want. I find it helpful just to say the Pali words. And then, we'll attach an English word to it. So the first one is sammādiṭṭhi. And we usually say something like right view. All of these, all of the items on this list start with sammā, which means right or correct, something or other. We're going to fill in the gap. So there's sammādiṭṭhi, which is the right view. We have to have a right view. There is sammāsaṅkappo. We have to have like a right intention. Sammāvācā, we have to have right speech, to speak with, maybe not lying and so forth. Sammākammanto, right action. sammāājīvo, right livelihood. We probably shouldn't be hitman, or there's all sorts of, we can imagine lots of occupations that are not really don't work for the benefit of humanity or the world. Sammāvāyāmo, we have to have like the right sort of resolve, or the right let's see, maybe we could just say the right effort. And then the last two on this list, we have to have like the word is sammāsati and sammāsamādhi. Probably heard the word samadhi, maybe sati. This is like we have to have the right concentration and almost like the right meditation practice. So I think there's going to be a part 2 to this, and I'm going to get into the specific items. And I'm going to leave this one here. I want to bring this to a close by saying that one of the really important aspects of this Eightfold Path is that sometimes when we are newly on the path, and I think no matter who or what we are, the human mind likes to seize upon one thing. We sort of like to be reductionist and say, I only have to do this one thing, and I can, achieve my goal. So a lot of people think all I have to do is meditate, or all I should do is meditate, and I will find find enlightenment and reach nirvana, etc., etc. But this Eightfold Path actually tells us that's not true. This is a very balanced diet for human beings, because no matter where you are, even if you're living in a monastery, which I've never done, but I'm kind of assuming, I've seen monks and sort of talked to various monks in Thailand. They have interactions with people as well, and of course they keep like 227 precepts, but which should of course be in accordance with this Eightfold Path. But the idea here is that we can't just do one thing. We are human beings. We're sort of complicated. We have like social interactions. We have interactions with ourselves. We have to, we have to plan about the future. Like, oftentimes it's like, well, we need to be in the moment. That's true, but sometimes in the moment we have to make decisions about the future. And so this Eightfold Path kind of gives us a framework which will allow us to navigate how to make decisions, basically. And we'll talk about that more in the next episode. But I just wanted to put that out there, that's one of the brilliant things about this Eightfold Path, is that right away, you don't only, it's not only about meditation. That's the last item mentioned. But it also has to do with, we have to have the right perspective. We have to start with the right perspective. We have to have like a right sort of intention when we do things. That's very big in Buddhism, like your mindset is actually sort of what's creating the karma, not even so much your actions, because you could accidentally do something which does not necessarily have negative or even positive karmic consequences. And we have to speak correctly, and we have to do these 8 things. And again, I want to point out that if we adhere to these 8 things, which I'm not saying is very easy, if it were, there would be people enlightened everywhere. And although maybe there are, and I'm just unaware of it, that it's possible that there are many people out there who are enlightened, and we're not aware of the fact. That's called a pachika Buddha, like a private Buddha, someone who's enlightened but doesn't share the teaching. More on that in another episode, but not saying that this is easy, but I do think it's easy to sort of, as a framework, it's easy. And it's easy, again, as a magic spell. You can recite it in English, however I would encourage you to look up the Eightfold Path in Wikipedia, or just in general. Maybe your favorite spiritual teacher alludes to it, use their translations, or think about the Pali, look up those words. And, for me, the Pali is like I said, it's a very succinct magic spell, sammādiṭṭhi, sammāsaṅkappo, sammāvācā, so on and so forth. It doesn't take long to say, and it just helps orient us and center us and allows us to sort of navigate the world, or actually I should say it helps us navigate the circumstances in which we find ourselves in this sort of complicated, chaotic world. So that's what I have for this episode. In the next one, we're going to discuss the 8 various items on this Eightfold Path list. Peace to everyone, and may all living beings everywhere be happy.